Daniel?
Oh my God! You're alive!
I'm sorry, do I know you?
Don't do this, Daniel! You're my husband. You disappeared 3 years ago. I thought you were dead.
My name isn't Daniel. It's Ethan.
Then why does your fiancé have my husband's face?
Two ushers took Victoria by the arms. She didn't fight them. She couldn't. Her legs had stopped belonging to her the moment the man at the altar said his name was Ethan. They walked her out through the side doors, past 200 faces frozen mid-gasp, past flowers she had helped her sister choose 3 weeks earlier. The doors closed behind her. Inside, the organ started again, uncertain, like it didn't know if it was still a wedding. Victoria stood on the church steps in the September light and did the only thing that made sense to her body in that moment. She laughed. Not because anything was funny, because 3 years of grief had just looked her in the eye and told her it didn't know her name. She had buried his watch. She had donated his suits. She had sat across from a grief counselor every Thursday for 8 months because some mornings she still reached for him in bed. And now the man wearing his face was calling security on her like she was the one who'd lost her mind. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Come home. We'll talk. Please don't cause any more trouble today." Victoria stared at the message for a long time. Any more trouble, as if she was the one who had done something wrong. Victoria didn't go home. She drove, without deciding to the house she used to share with Daniel. The one she still owned, the one she hadn't been able to sell. She let herself in. Dust in the air, caught in a blade of late sun through the blinds. She hadn't been inside in almost a year. In the hallway closet, behind winter coats she never wore anymore, was a box she'd never had the strength to donate with the rest of his things. She pulled it down and sat on the floor of a house that still smelled faintly like a life that had ended without warning. Inside the box, a watch he never wore because he said it made his wrist itch. A folded photograph from their honeymoon, sunburned and laughing on a pier. And a police report, 3 years old, with a single detail she had never let herself sit with too long. Positive identification made via personal effects recovered at scene. Wallet, wedding band. Formal identification of remains waived by next of kin due to condition. She had signed that waiver. Her mother had told her it would be kinder not to see him like that. She had been 28 and drowning in grief, and she had trusted the people around her to tell her the truth. Victoria read the line again. Waived by next of kin. Not confirmed. Waived. She had never once asked what condition meant. She had been too afraid of the answer. Now she was more afraid of not asking. Margaret Hayes opened her front door, already knowing what her daughter had come to say. Victoria didn't sit down. She held up the police report like evidence in a trial only she seemed to understand was happening. "You told me it was kinder not to see him," Victoria said. "You told me to sign the waiver." Margaret's hands twisted the dish towel she was still holding from the kitchen. She said the accident had been horrific. She said there had been nothing left to recognize. She said she had only been trying to protect her daughter from a memory that would never leave her. Victoria asked the question that had been building in her chest since the church. Had her mother seen Ethan Cole before today? Margaret's silence lasted 1 second too long. "There's something I have to tell you," she finally said. "And you're not going to like how long I've kept it from you." 18 months before the wedding, Margaret Hayes sat across from her younger daughter's new boyfriend at a family dinner and felt the room tilt. It wasn't a feeling this time. It wasn't grief playing tricks. Ethan reached for the salt the exact way Daniel used to. Left-handed, wrist turned in. A habit so specific she had teased her son-in-law about it for years. He said "sweetheart" to Sophie in a cadence that didn't belong to a stranger. When he laughed at something Margaret said, it was a sound she had heard across her own dinner table for 4 years before a river took it away. Margaret didn't sleep that night. 3 days later, she asked Sophie to come over alone, and she said it plainly. She believed the man her daughter was dating was Daniel. Sophie didn't deny it. She told her mother she already knew, that she'd known almost from the start, and that she'd done what Margaret hadn't. She'd asked him outright. The second time they met, over coffee, Sophie had asked Ethan, carefully, if the name Victoria meant anything to him. She watched his face for a flicker of recognition and got nothing but confusion in return. That was the night he told her about the accident that wasn't his to remember. The river, the fisherman, the hospital with no name to put on his chart. He told her, without knowing it, the story of his own disappearance, and she sat there already certain of who he used to be and said nothing back. She told her mother that finding out he had no memory of Victoria at all was what let her go through with it. He wasn't lying to anyone. He wasn't hiding from anyone. As far as his own mind was concerned, he had never been Daniel Ellison. Sophie decided that made it survivable. She decided it made it hers to keep. Margaret told her, in that kitchen, that she did not support the relationship and never would. Not out of jealousy or spite, but because somewhere in the city her older daughter was still setting a single plate at dinner some nights out of habit, still grieving a man who was, apparently, quite alive and about to become her sister's husband. Sophie asked her mother, in tears, to keep the secret. She said if Margaret told Victoria, it would destroy both her daughters at once. And for what? A diagnosis of memory loss that even doctors couldn't guarantee would ever reverse. She said maybe it was kinder to let a dead man stay dead, and let two women each keep the version of him they'd been given. Margaret didn't believe that. Not really. But she had already made one catastrophic decision about how her family handled Daniel Ellison. The waived identification, the closed casket, the choice to protect a daughter from a truth instead of giving it to her, and some cowardly part of her told her that opposing the marriage quietly and never speaking of it again was different from lying. It wasn't. She knew that now, sitting across from Victoria with the truth finally out of her mouth. She had spent 18 months disapproving of a wedding from the sidelines instead of stopping it, and somewhere in that gap between disapproval and action, 3 more years of her daughter's grief had gone on unnecessarily. Sophie arrived at Victoria's door still in fragments of her wedding day, makeup streaked, dress traded for jeans, veil left behind at a church she never finished walking through. She opened her mouth to say she was sorry. Victoria didn't let her get that far. Did you ever once think about what this would do to me? Her voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud, flat, controlled. The voice of someone who had already cried everything out of herself hours ago and had nothing left but the question. Not the wedding. Not today. I mean every single day for 2 years while you were falling in love with my husband. Sophie tried to speak. Victoria kept going because she'd been building this since the church steps, and it wasn't going to wait anymore. She asked her sister to walk her through it. Every birthday Victoria had spent crying into a cake with one less candle than she wanted to admit to. Every anniversary she'd driven out to a grave that, it turned out, held nothing but a stranger's remains and a wedding band Daniel never actually lost. The Thursday grief sessions. The nights she'd reached across an empty side of the bed out of habit. 2 years into a relationship her own sister was building with the man who should have been reaching back. You knew all of that was happening to me, Victoria said. And you knew why I didn't have to. Sophie was crying by then, the kind of crying that doesn't help either person in the room. Victoria asked one more question, the one she said she'd been circling since the moment Ethan turned around at the altar. Why had Sophie never once brought him around before the wedding? 2 years together, and Victoria had never met him, not at a birthday, not at a holiday, not at a single family dinner that Victoria herself had attended. Sophie had always had a reason. He was working. He was shy around new people. He wasn't ready. Victoria asked her sister to be honest, finally, about what the real reason had been. Sophie didn't try to soften it this time. She said she'd kept them apart on purpose. She said every excuse she gave was a lie built on top of the real one, that she couldn't survive watching Victoria's face the moment she recognized him, because some part of her already knew exactly what that face would do, and she wasn't ready to lose the life she'd built to it. So she scheduled around her sister. She timed visits. She made sure 2 years passed without the two people in the world most likely to unravel her secret ever standing in the same room, until a wedding made that impossible to control any longer. She said keeping them apart hadn't felt like protecting a secret while she was doing it. It had felt like protecting her sister. She knew now that was a lie she'd needed more than Victoria ever had. Victoria stood by the window for a long moment before she spoke again. "You didn't just take 2 years from me," she said. "You decided, over and over, that your happiness was worth more than my right to know I wasn't a widow. That's not confusion, Sophie. That's a choice you made every single day you kept him out of this house." Sophie didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. She said she understood if Victoria never forgave her. She said she wasn't asking for that today, only that Victoria know the guilt hadn't been quiet. It had followed her into every family dinner, every holiday photo she made sure Ethan skipped, every excuse she'd rehearsed so well it had started to feel almost true. It was the first time either sister had said any of it out loud. It didn't fix anything. But for the first time since the church, they were finally having the same conversation instead of two different ones. The next morning, Victoria sat across from the detective who had investigated Daniel's death 3 years earlier. He was retired now, technically, but he still kept his old notes in a garage full of boxes he told himself he'd sort through eventually. He remembered the case. He remembered it more than he wanted to admit. He told her something he hadn't said 3 years ago, because at the time it hadn't seemed to matter. The accident report noted a body recovered from a vehicle that had gone off a bridge into a river current. But there had been an early anonymous call to the department, weeks after the accident, about a man pulled from that same river, alive, miles downstream, with no memory of who he was. At the time, the department had closed the Ellison case. Identification had already been made. The lead detective assigned to that separate call had chalked it up to an unrelated drifter and moved on. No connection had ever been drawn between the two. Harris admitted, quietly, that he should have pulled that thread 3 years ago. He hadn't. Cases closed faster when families didn't ask more questions, and grieving families rarely did. He agreed to reopen the file. He told Victoria the next step wasn't accusations. It was a DNA test. Nothing else would hold up, and nothing else would give her the truth she could actually live inside. While Victoria built her case, Ethan Cole sat in a truck outside a house he no longer knew whether he could call home. He had grown up, by every memory he possessed, in a small town 3 states away, raised by a fisherman named John Cole, who had pulled a half-drowned stranger out of a river current with no ID, no memory, and a head wound that had erased everything before it. The hospital had no name to put on the paperwork. John had given him one instead, Ethan, after his own father, Cole, after himself. Ethan built an entire adult life believing that story completely, because it was the only story he had. He had never once, in 2 years with Sophie, felt anything but certainty about who he was. Until a stranger in a church called him by a different name, and something in his chest had moved before his mind caught up, a flicker, gone as fast as it came, like a word on the tip of his tongue in a language he didn't remember learning. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a lot of things that week. None of them stayed still. A week after the wedding that never finished, a lawyer named Mr. Bennett requested a meeting with Victoria. He had represented the insurance carrier that paid out Daniel's life insurance policy 3 years earlier, and he said he had recently been made aware, through a colleague following the reopened police file, of a detail that had never made it into any official report. He set an old folder on the table between them. Inside was a claims investigator's private note, filed and forgotten, questioning the speed of the original identification. The investigator had flagged the waived formal ID as unusual for a payout of that size and had recommended a delay pending dental record confirmation. The recommendation had been overruled by a supervisor eager to close the file before year-end numbers were due. Bennett said he wasn't here to reopen a legal claim. He was here because he had a conscience and because he had learned, secondhand, that a woman might have spent 3 years grieving a man who had simply been washed a few miles downriver and given a new name by people who loved him without knowing who he used to be. He said the DNA test would confirm what the paperwork never had the courage to ask. Detective Harris said the first problem was that no one had ever taken a DNA sample from Daniel Ellison while he was alive. There had never been a reason to. So, he went back to the one place that might still hold a trace of him, the box in the hallway closet on Maple Street. Inside it was a wooden hairbrush Victoria hadn't touched in 3 years, still carrying strands from the last time Daniel had used it. Harris sealed it himself and logged it as Daniel's reference sample. 2 days later, Ethan came in for his. Harris was there in person along with a notary, so there'd be no question later about where the sample came from. A technician swabbed the inside of Ethan's cheek, sealed it in front of both witnesses, and had Ethan sign the seal himself. 2 samples. One from a hairbrush no one had thought to throw away. One from a man who didn't yet know what he was about to prove. Both went to the lab the same afternoon. Victoria was standing in her kitchen, the same box from the closet still open on the counter, when Detective Harris read her the report over the phone in a voice too careful for good news or bad. Ethan Cole and Daniel Ellison were, genetically, the same person. Victoria sat down slowly on the kitchen floor, the phone still pressed to her ear, and said nothing at all for almost a full minute. 3 years of funerals that were never real. 3 years of a wedding ring she'd stopped wearing because it hurt too much to look at. 3 years of her own sister knowing exactly who Ethan was and choosing, every single day since, to let Victoria keep grieving a dead man instead. He wasn't dead. He simply didn't know he had ever been alive as someone else. Margaret arranged the meeting because someone had to, and because she owed her daughter at least that much penance. Victoria and Ethan sat across from each other in a room that wasn't a church and wasn't a courtroom, just a quiet space with 2 chairs and 3 years of silence between them. She didn't ask him to remember her. She simply set the honeymoon photograph on the table between them, the pier, the sunburn, the laughing, and let it exist in the space where words weren't landing. Ethan looked at it for a long time. He said quietly that he didn't remember the pier. He didn't remember her voice, or her name, or a wedding, or a life on Maple Street. The doctors had told him years ago that memory loss from trauma, like his, was often permanent. The brain doesn't always give back what it decides to protect itself from. But he said one thing had followed him for 2 years without explanation. A specific, wordless ache whenever certain songs played. A flinch, every single time, at the sound of tires on wet pavement. A single phrase that surfaced in his sleep sometimes, in his own voice, meaning nothing to him and everything to her the moment she heard it. Home before dark, Vic promised me. It was the last thing he had said to her the night of the accident. Victoria put her hand over her mouth and, for the first time since the church, she wasn't laughing. Sophie came to Victoria's door one final time, without makeup, without a version of herself built for anyone else's comfort. She didn't call herself a victim of an impossible situation this time. She had used up that version of the story already, and it hadn't held. She said she was ending the engagement, not because the DNA results made the decision for her, but because she had spent 2 years knowing exactly who Ethan was and choosing, deliberately, again and again, to let her sister keep mourning a man who was alive. That wasn't confusion. It wasn't an accident of the heart. It was a choice she had made and kept remaking every time she had the chance to tell the truth and didn't. She said she wasn't asking to be understood. She said she only wanted Victoria to know that she knew exactly what she'd done and wasn't going to hide behind soft words for it anymore. Victoria didn't forgive her that day. She told her sister, honestly, that forgiveness wasn't going to arrive on anyone's schedule but her own, and that what Sophie had taken from her wasn't a fiancé. It was 3 years she would never get back, spent grieving something that had never needed to be grieved at all. It was the first real conversation between them since the wedding. It wasn't peace, but it was a door left open instead of slammed shut. Daniel, because that was undeniably his name. Whatever new one had been given to him by a river and a stranger's kindness did not simply step back into the marriage he had lost 3 years of. He told Victoria, gently, that he couldn't hand her the husband she had buried, because that man's memories were gone, possibly forever. What he could offer her was the truth, his honesty, and the willingness to find out, slowly, without promises he couldn't keep, whether two people who had once built a life together could build something new from what remained. Victoria told him that was more than she'd had in 3 years of a headstone with his name on it. Margaret finally said out loud what she'd been circling for weeks, that her rushed advice to waive the identification had come from her own fear of confronting a coffin, not from protecting her daughter, and that 18 months of disapproving of Sophie's engagement from a distance, without ever picking up the phone and telling Victoria the truth, wasn't caution. It was the same cowardice wearing a second face. 2 decisions, 3 years apart, both born from the same instinct to protect herself from the hardest conversation in the room. She told Victoria she didn't expect forgiveness for either one. She only wanted her daughter to know the silence had never once been about not caring. It had been about caring in exactly the wrong direction. John Cole, the fisherman who had raised a stranger as his own son, drove 3 states to meet the family of the man he'd once pulled, half-drowned and nameless, out of a river. He didn't apologize for the name he'd given him. He said giving a lost man an identity had never felt like a lie. It had felt like mercy. Nobody in that room disagreed with him. 3 years is a long time to grieve someone. It is an even longer time to discover that grief was built on a rushed decision, a waived form, and a family too afraid to ask the one question that might have ended it years sooner. Are you sure? Victoria didn't get her husband back exactly, as she'd lost him. Nobody in this story got exactly what they thought they wanted. Sophie lost the man she loved. Margaret lost the comfort of pretending disapproval was the same thing as honesty. Daniel lost 3 years he will never recover and gained a truth he never asked for. But sometimes the truth doesn't arrive to give you back what you lost. Sometimes it just arrives to make sure you're not building the rest of your life on top of a lie. Victoria kept the box from the closet. She didn't put the watch back inside it. She put it on her nightstand instead, next to a phone that no longer had a headstone's photo as its lock screen, just a pier, a sunburn, and 2 people who were, however slowly, learning how to laugh at the same things again.